The 24th of February marked 2 years since Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. While recent conflicts between the two countries goes back to 2014, when Russia-backed troops invaded and annexed Crimea from Ukraine, the February 2022 invasion of Ukraine is due to NATO's expansion treaty and its recruitment of Ukraine's membership, which brought an existential threat to Russia. About 8 million Ukrainians have been internally displaced, and more than 8.2 million have left that country. The war is said to have created Europe's largest refugee crisis since World War II. Professor of African Politics at UNISA Everisto Benyera joins us to discuss this issue. Professor, thank you. It's great to have you here on the program.
Good morning, Leanne. Good morning to the viewers, and thank you for having me.
It's hard to believe that 2 years this has been raging on, and the numbers of casualties differ starkly to different numbers that are released, whether we look at what the US are saying or whether we look at what the Ukraine are saying. I mean, it's up to 100,000 soldiers that may have lost their lives just on the Ukrainian side, and perhaps more than that on the Russian side, not to mention the amount of people that have been displaced and causing, as we've said in the introduction, a catastrophe that we haven't seen since World War II. Perhaps at this point, 2 years down the line, we can get an update. I mean, are you surprised it's still going on? Is there an end in sight, or is it just expected to get worse?
This is a very curious case, and I always marvel at how during the beginning of the intensification of what others have called the end of the long peace, an Iranian General Qasem Soleimani, was killed by the United States in Iraq. So there are three countries, and you begin to see a global loss for the appetite for peace. And we begin to see what others called the democratization and normalization of destruction. But more to your point, there is a lot of asymmetrical wars that are being fought. If you look at Israel, the Israeli Defense Force, one of the most well-equipped in the world, versus the Hamas, which is a combination of two brigades. Then Russia and Ukraine. The normal feeling when the war started on 24 February 2022 was that the so-called military operation would be over within a week. Then others said at worst it will go on for a month. Now we are talking about 2 years and still counting. Asymmetrical wars are very complicated, and also the gap between the most militarized and the less militarized has been reduced because of advances in technology. So this war is not going to end very soon.
No.
Political problems cannot be solved by military means.
And that's the reality. And I mean, that leads us into quite an interesting point. I mean, we much publicized the visit from different African leaders that approached Russian President Vladimir Putin. They tried to do these talks to try and bridge that divide and say, military solutions, killing doesn't help. Let's sit around a table. Let's try and sort this out. We remember the trip well. I mean, there certainly were issues that came with that. But anything come out of that? Any positive results at all that we are still sitting here 2 years since this invasion? Was that meeting actually taken seriously?
The short answer, Leanne, is that show me the person who is supplying the arms, and I will show you the person who can end the war. Without the involvement of the major backers in this war, and for Ukraine, it is the United States, this war will never end. This war will not be ended by Ukraine, but by the United States and NATO sitting together with Russia and saying, how do we bring peace to Europe? And by extension, let me put it this way, Leanne, the United States developed an international order that they are now abandoning. Some blame it on Donald Trump, but we see the collective United States not having an appetite to lead. They are now hesitant to lead, especially to lead in the development and deployment of peace through diplomacy, inversely preferring war as the first and only means to manage global affairs. We saw this with Libya, we saw it with Syria, we saw it with Iraq, and now we are seeing it with Ukraine, Gaza, and even some would say the war in Sudan between those two generals can be traced to America's inability and lack of appetite for peace, if I may put it bluntly like that.
Yeah, it certainly appears that way. That's something that we're seeing. And I mean, I know in order to mark the 2 years of what's been, been a very protracted and vicious war that's been unfolding there, we see that some countries, from the leaders of Canada, Belgium, Italy, as well as the EU head, Ursula von der Leyen, went and traveled to Kiev to show solidarity. And of course, you've got the US also still promising to supply a lot of money to fund aid to them for military intervention and to supply weapons. I mean, we're talking about $61 billion of military assistance. They're obviously still waiting for Congress approval on that, unless it's already been given. I'm not too sure. Please correct me. But I mean, this is, Europe is showing a lot more interest in this in terms of perhaps getting involved as well. I mean, are we going to see forces besides the Ukraine and Russia fighting, and we'll see other countries getting involved? There have been threats of this.
Europe is not threatened by Russia at all, but rather what Europe is doing is to prepare for the possibility that Donald Trump can be elected the next president of the United States. And Donald Trump made utterances to the effect that you can and has the capacity to stop the war in Ukraine within 24 hours. So Europe is sort of preparing a plan B in case Donald Trump is the president, and then he may not be willing to continue fighting this war. Because the bottom line is that this war is having a devastating impact, not only in Russia and Ukraine, but also in Europe in terms of the energy insecurity, in terms of the high cost of living, and to the United States. Now the domestic politics, for the first time, an issue of foreign policy, which is the Russia-Ukraine war and the Israeli-Hamas war, is a big factor in American domestic politics. And Joe Biden is threatened by losing, he stands to lose a huge number of votes because of his inability to enforce a ceasefire, or rather to support that ceasefire. So Europe, yes, is preparing for life without the United States, but they are also grouping on their own and saying, how can we also formulate and put forward our own foreign policy in Ukraine without the United States? Because, Leanne, the bottom line is that the United States undermined the rules-based order that it helped build and put in place.
I want to speak to you a little bit about the attention that, I mean, in the beginning, Russia, Ukraine was all we spoke about. And then suddenly a lot of that attention has been shifted and we don't hear too much about it. Obviously, it's still being covered extensively in international news. We do know that. But, with the shift of focus and the tension onto what's happening in Israel and Palestine, it seems that it gets a lot more attention at this point. Why? Are countries just sort of tired of focusing on it, or why is it not getting that same attention that it was getting right in the beginning?
Who is worth mourning? Who is human? It is a fact of life that the world system that we live in is racially hierarchicized. So when the Ukraine conflict was getting a lot of airplay, it was because the Ukrainians by then were the humans. They were the ones that were being mourned. They were the ones that were being sympathized with. But now, when the war in Israel broke out on 7 October, that matrix changed because now the Israeli victims started getting more attention. There is something, Leanne, in international order that are called the 5 monopolies of capitalism. And one of these 5 monopolies of capitalism is news. So what gets to be broadcast is not an obvious matter, but because news and the newsroom and news corporations are businesses which must make money, but most importantly, which are owned and controlled by certain people, by certain interests. The narrative that then gets to be prioritized is the narrative that favors he who pays the piper, or the one that is in control of the purse. To cut a short story long, the pecking order now is Israel on top, followed by Ukraine, and at the bottom of the food chain is Sudan. Yet the civil war in Sudan is affecting much more people. It is displacing over 7.7 internally displaced persons in Sudan, yet it does not get as much airplay as the war in Gaza. But even that Gaza conflict, the manner in which it is portrayed, it is not a balanced view. So we are all humans, but some humans are more human than other humans.
Animal farm in action. Yeah, a nice way of putting it, I suppose. Very quickly, what has been the impact to us here in Africa since this? I mean, we know we saw prices increasing of many of the goods that we buy and import, and the price of living went through the ceiling when we saw what was happening in Russia, Ukraine. That was, of course, again intensified by what's been happening in Israel and Palestine. Talk to us about the repercussions that we've been feeling here in Africa because of what's been happening around the world in terms of these wars.
We have been experiencing what is known as imported inflation. For example, the Ansari Allah, popularly known as Houthis, have made navigation through the Red Sea very expensive. The cost of fuel will go up. The cost of imported goods will go up. Africa is a net exporter and a net importer. So any destabilization of shipping will definitely affect everything that we use here in Africa. So definitely the war will have an impact in that it will cause an increase in the cost of living. Our involvement as South Africa, and by extension as Africans, in the International Court of Justice is threatening to bring sanctions to South Africa. We all know the history and the repercussions of American sanctions on an African state, that it will trigger a loss of value for the currency, that it will trigger regime change, and that it will make states unstable and vulnerable to become failed states. Domestic politics, for the first time in South Africa, elections are now being contested over foreign policy. Our position as different political parties on the Gaza war is threatening to shift voters from one political party to the other. We saw it in the Western Cape, that for the first time, the Democratic Alliance is facing a huge backlash because of its support for Israel, given that most of the voters in the Western Cape support the DA, and they are also pro-Palestine. So we are going to have a lot of repercussions as a result of this war, some direct, some indirect. The most dreaded ones are the sanctions that the Americans are debating, and I think their decision is coming in less than 110 days from today, Lian.
All right, we leave it there. Prof, thank you. Thanks so much for talking to us about the issue in Russia, Ukraine. That, of course, a war that's been raging on now for 2 years, entering into its third year, would you believe it? And this is something that we watch very closely. The repercussions are felt here. Add to that what's happening in Israel and Palestine, and things really looking tough in terms of the world at war right now. Professor of African Politics at UNISA Everisto Benyera, reflecting on these issues.